Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Tim Horgan. I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. We really appreciate you all making time to come out for this wonderful event, and we really appreciate Secretary Moniz coming for this event. I want to take a moment to thank a couple people for helping to make tonight possible. First, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, helping us to bring the Secretary up for this event, as well as Shay from 360 Campaign Consulting for helping us to make sure that this event goes off really smoothly. And she, while she doesn't live in New Hampshire anymore, she's a fond growing up, has great memories of growing up around here and some really good contacts. So thank you to both of them for helping to make tonight possible. Also, thank you to Southern New Hampshire University, our mission partner on events like this, to make sure that we have great space and wonderful food and all of the amenities that we need in order to make these events happen. So, for those of you who may not know the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that's dedicated to helping people understand complex international issues so that they can make better choices and understand the impacts of global events and how they may come back to New Hampshire as we live in a very globalized society. We are a platform for discussion, and we hope that you take these opportunities for all of our events to talk, to learn, to talk, and to have further discussions about these complex issues. Having said that, we are required by law to mention that because we are a nonpartisan and nonprofit, we do not support or endorse the thoughts or ideas of any of our speakers. They do not necessarily represent the ideas of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, its board, its sponsors, its partners, all of those good things. So I will end my pitch there, and I will come back at the end to close some things up. But I'd like to take a moment to bring Professor Pam Jordan up from Southern New Hampshire University, the Professor of Politics and Global Studies, to introduce. Thank you.
Thank you. So you all may already be aware that last Thursday, January 23rd, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists adjusted the so-called doomsday clock to 100 seconds before midnight, which is the closest it's ever been to the brink of planetary destruction. That's why we're very fortunate to have with us today someone who can educate us further on the issues of nuclear dangers and a new nuclear arms race. Former Secretary of Energy, Dr. Ernest Moniz. Thank you very much for coming. Dr. Moniz will address themes from his recent article in Foreign Affairs magazine, The Return of Doomsday. The title, The Return of Doomsday, the New Nuclear Arms Race, and How Washington and Moscow Can Stop It, written with former Senator Sam Nunn. Dr. Moniz, now co-chair and CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, will discuss today's growing risk of nuclear war or detonation by accident or terrible miscalculation, and he'll present solutions that can bring us back from the brink. Dr. Moniz is a leader on reducing the existential risks posed by nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction, as well as a leader on addressing climate change. As Energy Secretary, he advanced energy technology innovation, nuclear security, cutting-edge capabilities for the American scientific research community, and environmental stewardship. He also negotiated the Iran nuclear agreement with then Secretary of State John Kerry. In 2017, he took the helm of NTI, a nonprofit, nonpartisan global security organization focused on the reduction of nuclear and biological threats imperiling humanity. Thank you very much for coming to speak with us today, Dr. Moniz. We look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Professor Jordan and Tim. But Pam, I have to say that I didn't actually negotiate with Kerry. He and I negotiated with Iran, and, except over like what we'd have for lunch, and this kind of a thing, which occasionally was important. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really want to thank all of you for coming out to have a chat about something lighthearted like nuclear dangers. Let me just say a word as to why my colleagues and I are here in New Hampshire today. We've done a number of media events during the day, for example, and we're here because, the people of Iowa and New Hampshire have a special position in every 4 years, this being one of those years, and our view is that in Iowa and New Hampshire there's such a different kind of relationship of the voters with the candidates. Frankly, I think the opportunity to influence, to raise issues with candidates, help set priorities. And what we're here for is to say that we believe that while we understand that healthcare and economy and education are always going to be front and center, but that there are other issues in the foreign affairs, national security, and specifically nuclear security realms that really need to have more discussion among the candidates. This is an area, particularly the use of, preferably the non-use of nuclear weapons, resisting any further proliferation of nuclear weapons. These are areas where the president has especially unique responsibilities. For example, only the president can authorize the use of a nuclear weapon. Not the uniformed military, it's the president's. It's a unique responsibility. And yet, if confronted with information which may be correct or incorrect, that there is, for example, an attack coming on the United States, that president, he or she, would have probably at best 10 minutes to make an extremely consequential decision. Therefore, that's not the time to start the education. It would be a good idea right now to get to understand what do the candidates, what do those who might be the next president, whether it's the current president or not, what is their view in terms of currently how to address these nuclear issues, how to improve stability in the nuclear realm. And we think that, again, I'll repeat what Tim said. This is not a partisan statement. It's certainly not a statement about any individual candidate. It's an issue of, we very much hope that all of you and your neighbors and fellow voters in New Hampshire will be able to raise these issues and find out what the candidates think, how well they are prepared to deal with these extremely important issues. So I think that's the background as to why we are here today in New Hampshire, as we were in Iowa some weeks back. So please, whatever your views, just try to get this as at least a topic of conversation as we head to the primary and then to the general election. Now, with that, let me just comment on about 4 issues and then leave time for our conversation with Professor Jordan and questions and answers and comments, outrage statements, whatever you want with all of you. So first, as Professor Jordan said, let's talk a little bit about the situation in the United States and Russia with regard to the nuclear issues. The first thing is to focus the mind. One should remember that the United States and Russia continue to have roughly 92% of the world's nuclear weapons. When you talk about existential threat, hopefully very low probability, but a very high consequence. It's the U.S. You got to start with the U.S. and Russia, because that's where, on each side, there are thousands of nuclear weapons, and in our view, unfortunately, what you might call, at least an incipient arms race prime, in the sense that, for example, last year, Russia's President Putin, many of you may have seen his PowerPoint presentation of what is eventually 6 new nuclear weapons delivery systems, including hypersonic, maneuverable missiles, including novel nuclear-propelled long-range torpedoes with massive nuclear weapons attached to them, et cetera. On our side, we saw the renewed commitment to developing and deploying new small, so-called small nuclear weapons. Still makes for a pretty bad day, like 5 kilotons, and on our nuclear submarines, creating a number of issues, including the fact that one is now getting confused signals. If a missile is shot from a submarine, the adversary doesn't know what it's carrying anymore, for example. And secondly, it is a slippery slope. I don't mean just, I mean what the United States and Russia are doing. There's a slippery slope towards losing the concept that the point of nuclear weapons are deterrence and not battlefield weapons. It's not just, oh, it's a little bit of a bigger bomb, you know, to use in some battlefield situation. So we feel that the situation is such that the risk of a nuclear weapon being used, and I say this now, I want to make clear, not just U.S. and Russia, but the risk of a nuclear weapon being used in all of the parts of the world where we see nuclear weapons and difficult circumstances is higher today probably than any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so the question is, how are we going to go about trying to reduce this danger, reduce the risk, and enhance stability. Now, a second reason why we feel that the risks are higher today is not so much because of some intentional, premeditated, let's surprise them by sending 1,000 missiles their way. That's, we believe we are past that. There still is mutual assured destruction. But the problem is mistakes, miscalculations, misunderstandings, and that there's many reasons why that could happen today, more so than in some decades past. One is new technology, like cyber risks. Not cyber risks of a hacker shooting a missile out of North Dakota, but, for example, compromising the early warning systems, the satellite-based systems, compromising the command and control system for weapons. Those are the kinds of actions that can lead to mistakes, very, very bad mistakes. We have had these kinds of things happen before for other reasons and barely dodged the bullets. Now with cyber, and it's not just country to country, it can be third parties, obviously. That's an example of an additional element of instability. Yet, we have no norms whatsoever for cyber actions or for space actions dealing with the nuclear weapon system and the decision system. A second reason, which is more self-inflicted, is that we do not have, between the United States and Russia, and there are the reasons are understood, things like election interference, Ukraine, and the like, On the Russian side, they would go back to things like NATO expansion and other, literally to their borders. The result is we do not have the stabilizing influence of ongoing discussions on the existential threat of nuclear weapons anywhere near what we had at the height of the Cold War. During the Cold War, we had ongoing military-to-military discussions. Something goes wrong, you know who to call. Try to get this cleared up. We don't have anything like the wealth of scientist-to-scientist exchanges that we had. The relationships that in a pinch really are brought to bear. We just don't have that today. And so this is why we consider the risk environment to be elevated, particularly through misunderstandings that could lead to escalations that would be very, very bad. So we do recommend a few steps. And, you know, in this business, it's modest steps that one needs to take. Certainly reestablishing those channels of communication at various levels is important. Another thing of great importance is not ending the age of arms control. Today, and we know we've had a series of these actions over some time now. This is not, I'm not talking about the last few years. We can go back to the, for example, the abrogation of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. More recently, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was what in the 80s kind of stabilized the situation between Europe and Russia, with the elimination of intermediate range missiles that could strike each other quite quickly. That's now gone. And now, and this is the kind of area where, again, I think understanding what candidates would do is so important. The New START Treaty. Now, I think most of you know, I'll just say briefly, the New START Treaty has two features common to arms control agreements. One is it's a cap on the number of weapons and delivery systems that can be there. And two, less talked about, but very important, providing mutual on-the-ground verification activities. So that we each side kind of knows what's going on. Very, very important. We are now in a situation where the New START Treaty will expire 2 weeks into the next administration. So whether it is this year, and we certainly hope it will be this year and soon, that the extension for 5 more years takes place, or at the very beginning of the next administration, that we think this is very, very important, clearly. Let me tie that back to things like the new Russian delivery systems that Putin presented last year. The Russians have now acknowledged that if the New START Treaty is extended, things like the hypersonic weapons, which they say they have developed specifically to avoid missile defenses, will be covered under New START. So if we have the treaty going on for 5 years, it will cover those new delivery systems. It will also provide the 5 years to 6 years from today, 2 weeks into the next administration. It'll provide the opportunity for restarting discussions, for example, among other things, on those other systems that Putin presented that will not be covered by New START, like the long-range torpedo, for example. So this is something that is absolutely critical for stability. Without it, there is nothing to stop an arms race. More important, in my view, all verification measures, on-the-ground verification measures, are lost. This can only provide more uncertainty, more opportunity for miscalculation and blunder. That's why in the article that was referred to earlier, in the Foreign Affairs article, we say that both countries are sleepwalking towards a disaster and seemingly wanting it that way at this stage. So we need to have a serious discussion in the political sphere about how are we going to have stability going forward in a world with new threats, new risks, and a lack of communication. Finally, and I mentioned already the need to start these in the discussions, the norms for cyber, the norms for space, et cetera. These are all things that we need to do with Russia. But I'll mention one other step. There are many others, but there are one other step that we need to take to help stabilize the situation and have these kinds of serious discussions. It starts at home. We do not have the kind of relationship between Congress and administration, between parties, that we had in the 1980s. When Ronald Reagan was president, for example, the Senate had an explicit arms control observer group, high-level leaders in the Congress meeting monthly with the Secretary of State. And that meant that we could generate a common position on something that clearly is not a partisan issue, survivability in a nuclear age. And also very important would be a signal to Russia that if there were agreements reached with the administration, that they would not be undermined then in a congressional activity. So we have strongly advocated that the leadership of both the House and the Senate get together, put together teams who would work with, for example, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and get common positions that can give us a platform and give also confidence that fruitful discussions will actually lead to a successful outcome. So that's the kind of general picture I would paint in terms of our need for working with Russia on these existential threats, even as we recognize that we will continue to have serious disagreements and serious issues in other domains. Actually, the analogy, again, going back to, I mentioned already President Reagan, just to note that when President Reagan pursued a very active arms control agenda with the Soviet Union, it wasn't as though everything else was nice and peaceful between the United States and the Soviet Union. But he and the Secretary of State, George Shultz, recognized that, you got to compartment this and keep working on the other issues. So let me just touch on more briefly three other areas and which we can have come up, if you like, in discussion. One, obviously, is North Korea. And we strongly supported the idea of opening up the dialogue with North Korea. However, the opening up the dialogue needs to be followed by arduous, difficult, step-by-step negotiations towards denuclearization, recognizing it's a long slog, and that's the only way you can get there, ultimately by building up enough confidence in the regional security situation that one could have North Korea verifiably eliminating its nuclear capabilities. So once again, and you can see a hierarchy where you start out, for example, with a first step would be to codify a freezing elimination of tests of ballistic missiles, long-range missiles, and weapons. You could then go to the nuclear materials, stop the production of materials, reverse that, get rid of materials. Finally, longer step, the actual weapons themselves, as, again, the security situation and the economic situation potentially improves. So just as an example of what we do at NTI in terms of thinking about how can this go forward is a proposal that the Nunn-Lugar program, you've heard now Sam Nunn mentioned twice tonight. I should say that Sam was the founding CEO of NTI and was the only CEO of NTI until the summer of 2017 when I took that role, but remains a co-chairman of the board, and we are very, very active collaborators. And so one of the issues was to propose with North Korea, early on in the negotiation, put a non-Lugar program on the table. Those of you, many of you may recall, the non-Lugar program was a very, very important program put forward just after the collapse of the Soviet Union and then the Russian economy in order to work with Russian scientists and engineers in terms of addressing the dangers. This is the same thing. With North Korea, the idea was, we're not going to do denuclearization to you, we're going to do it with you. And that, of course, has the collateral benefit, as it did with the former Soviet Union, of employing, frankly, the nuclear scientists and engineers who we really don't want wandering away. So that's the kind of solution that we are trying to think about, how we can add concrete steps that's, again, step by step, reduce dangers. A couple of words on Iran. This obviously remains in the news. Let me just first clarify, because there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of confusion as to what the Iran deal is. It's pretty simple at a high level. It's got two pieces. One piece is that Iran's peaceful nuclear program would have severe constraints on it for 15 years. That part now, Iran has said, in reaction to American withdrawal, that part is now moot, at least for the moment. Iran emphasizes, and it's true, that the steps they've taken are reversible. They can go back to where they were, get rid of the extra uranium, enriched uranium they produced, the extra heavy water they produced, et cetera. And that's no longer operative. However, and this is the part that is not projected in the media coverage, the more important part of the agreement is that word that I mentioned earlier, verification. The agreement gives the international inspectors completely unique, very powerful opportunities to see what's going on in Iran. You know, Iran had a nuclear weapons program through 2003. There's no question about it. The idea that they would resume a nuclear weapons program now in an overt way, which they didn't do through 2003, is bluntly ridiculous. The issue is, do they use the technologies that they've developed in a covert way to try to develop a nuclear weapon? This is where the extra tools given to the international inspectors is so critical. For example, it includes a commitment by Iran in the agreement that the IAEA inspectors can go anywhere in the country where there is suspect activity forever. All you hear about is sunset clauses. This is forever if the agreement sticks. Verification is the foundation of international confidence in non-nuclear weapons activities. Not to mention things like, uniquely, for 25 years, this is for 25 years, the IAEA, the international inspectors, have access to visibility in the entire uranium supply chain. So if you're going to have a covert program, you also got to get the enriched uranium from somewhere, et cetera, et cetera. So what I want to emphasize is, up to now, proof is in the pudding going forward. And I also wrote an article a few years back on the Iran deal called Don't Trust and Verify, Verify, Verify. That remains the philosophy. it's very important Iran has so far not violated the verification measures. So that's a big key. That's, again, the kind of thing we have to understand. How can we, with our partners in Europe and Russia and China, maintain that critical feature of the verification regime? And finally, the last thing I'll just comment on is that, especially since 9/11, there has been enormous concern about terrorist acquisition of nuclear weapons, or more likely, nuclear weapons material, highly enriched uranium, 90% enriched uranium, for example. Because the bad news is, it's the material, stupid. If you got enough high weapons-grade uranium, making an explosive is not very difficult. In fact, I remind you that if you think back to World War II, the weapon dropped on Hiroshima was a high-enriched uranium bomb. It was never tested. The test in Alamogordo was of a plutonium bomb with a much more complicated mechanism. So keeping HEU out of the hands of terrorists is absolutely critical. Even better, eliminating it. At least here, I can end with some, at least half positive news. First of all, I think it's not well known that 10%, I'm averaging out, 10% of American electricity for 20 years came from Russian weapons, high-enriched uranium. It's the most successful nonproliferation program ever. 500 tons, conservatively 20,000 nuclear weapons worth of high-enriched uranium was blended down to make nuclear reactor fuel for the United States. And it supplied half of our fleet for 20 years. Now the question is continuing to eliminate, secure this material. Over 20 countries in the last 20 years have become HEU free. That's great news. The bad news is there's still another 22 to go. But enormous progress has been made in this, and again, one cannot, I think, overestimate the importance of controlling this material, securing it, and even eliminating it from the earth. So those are 4 areas I just wanted to touch on to key off a conversation. And Professor Jordan, I'm ready for the conversation. Well, you're very kind.
And then it's already on, so that's good. Yeah. I think mine is already on too. So thank you thank you. That's fantastic. Thank you very much for your remarks, and it gives us a lot on which to build our questions. I know that we have, about 15 or so minutes, because I wanted to give you enough time to ask questions to Dr. Moniz. So, and I imagine that you'll have a number of specific questions about some of those points that he raised, too, about North Korea, Iran. So I wanted to ask you a few more questions about the architecture, more about the architecture of nuclear arms control. What you think the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that's been around now for, 50 years, over 50 years. What kind of role it plays now in arms control. And then also a bit about the treaty that very few people know about and hasn't even entered into force, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons that no nuclear weapon state yet has ratified, and I think there are only about 35 ratifications, and 50 are needed for it to enter into force. So could you talk a bit about those 2 treaties, and especially, of course, the NPT, which is the foundation of arms control? Thank you.
Yes, well, your last statement was exactly right. The Non-Proliferation Treaty ultimately is the key foundation for all of this. Every 5 years, there's a review conference that is coming up this year. The prospects for a productive discussion are not great. It's gotten rougher and rougher every 5 years, and this one looks to continue the trend. The core issue, and this then relates to the second treaty on essentially abolishing nuclear weapons. The key hang-up is that, of course, the NPT bargain fundamentally was that the signatories who don't have nuclear weapons don't develop nuclear weapons. The signatories that had nuclear weapons at the time would work down those stockpiles to zero over time. So, and then the other treaty kind of codifies that there should be no nuclear weapons.
Yeah,
The
in Article 6.
Yeah.
Two references, a future treaty, disarmament treaty.
Correct. Now, when the abolition treaty was negotiated, unfortunately, none of the weapon states elected to turn up for the discussion. In 2017, correct, in 2017. And that did not increase the level of comity going forward. And now the issue is that it makes it even tougher for the NPT review conference this year. So personally, I think it's going to be extremely difficult to come out of that with any kind of consensus statement. I mean, kind of the water has been fouled even more, personally, I think it's also why it'd be so important if the U.S. and Russia, particularly because of the enormous stockpiles, they have come. By the way, we should count our blessings in the sense that tens of thousands of nuclear weapons have been eliminated. The question is, people are wondering whether there's going to be a push to the end or not over the next decades. But I think that statements, agreements made by the U.S. and Russia in this time period could dramatically change the tone of the discussions. And the simplest thing is, in fact, this New START extension, because it does not require any legislative action. It only requires the two presidents to agree and sign their names. And we have the extension. And that would be a very positive sign, in contrast to the very negative sign if we have to go into that conference with the whole future of arms control in doubt. So this is important. There are also simpler things which may not sound so consequential, but we think are. For example, and NTI has been very forward-leaning on this now for a couple years. Here I go again, President Reagan and Gorbachev in the 80s issued a very simple statement with regard to the U.S.-Russia situation. They said, a nuclear war cannot be won, and therefore it should not be fought. Very simple, doesn't have a force of law or anything, but very, very simple, elegant statement. We suggest maybe a statement like that should be made again. And actually, frankly, Russia has announced now, just in the last months, that they are prepared to issue that statement. So this is another opportunity, I think, for the United States to, again, do something that's positive. Frankly, an even more wild idea is that, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about not extending treaties unless China becomes part of it. All right, you want to ask me, or should I just answer? All right, okay.
I thought that was
Right.
important.
Right. So, yeah, exactly. So China has said something that you should just take them at face value and believe them. They are telling you the truth. No chance that we're going to sign like a New START treaty with the United States and Russia. Their arsenals remain more than a factor of 10 smaller, for one thing. And I don't want to negotiate them up to the same level that we have. So that's not going to happen. But what about this elegant statement? Maybe they could join a statement like that. Okay? So, I think looking for home runs is not the way this business works. Yeah, you got to be ready to do the hard work, and sustain it, sustain the human resource in the governments with constant contact, and just keep working away at the problems step by step, and eventually get there.
Agree. I do not disagree with you on that at all. And no but. China, I agree in terms of a New START treaty. China shouldn't necessarily be a partner in that. But it should agree in terms of principles and norms and accepting those norms.
And France and
France
and UK as well.
Yeah, exactly.
I won't get into relative difficulty.
Oh, right. Yeah, exactly. Given we're running out of time here, I did want to bring up a really interesting opinion poll that NTI just published recently about voter opinion on nuclear weapons, just to emphasize the importance of this topic around this time, right, as voters. That in this poll, 87% of Democrats, 81% of Republicans, and 71% of independents said they would feel more favorably toward a candidate who puts a high priority on reducing the threats posed by nuclear weapons. So we have to give our voters more credit. They're thinking along these lines already.
And are you going to add the other part?
The other part about what they're most interested in,
specific
plans?
No, specifically favoring the nuclear risk reduction focus of a president, and not favoring the expansion of the nuclear stockpile. Was also part of it.
So that is a basis on which we all can agree as Americans, regardless of our party, of our ideology. That's why, having read your and Senator Nunn's article in Foreign Affairs, I was very much persuaded by your solutions. As incremental as they are, I think that is for the best. And in terms of Congress, once this impeachment process is over, maybe they can settle on an issue that they know all Americans will back.
Could I actually just insert an anecdote along those lines?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's an important one, I think, that Sam Nunn and I have also written about. In fact, I think it's even in that article as well. Namely, that the Congress a couple years ago passed new sanctions on Russia that did not include the standard waiver opportunity for the president, that is, the president waiving them in the interest of national security. We oppose that. That is, the Congress not including the waiver for the president. And the reason is that if you are Russia in this case, and it takes the Congress to remove the sanctions, you got to figure you're never going to get out of the penalty box. That occurred, some of you may remember, I regret to say that some of you are of the age, you may remember, the Jackson-Vanik sanctions, which that came into force in the 70s. It dealt with Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union. And it did not have that national security waiver. It took, the Soviets fundamentally satisfied the requirement in the 80s. Finally, in the 90s, President Clinton certified to Congress that the Soviets were in compliance. And finally, I think it was in 2010, something like that, the Congress lifted those sanctions. And they lifted them only when simultaneously applying new sanctions. So right now we're in a situation where even if I want to, how do I get out of the penalty box?
That's a good point as well. So should we move on to open questions and answers period at this point? Just keeping with our schedule?
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah.
So I'm probably going to be running around with this one microphone, unfortunately. But I don't know if you want to call on people and I'll hand them the mic, or it's up to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. But Dr. Moniz, sorry, he's asked me to start with the students.
Okay.
First question.
And because I have suggested that if they ask a well-informed question, then they don't have to do the write-up summarizing Dr. Moniz's main points to get their extra credit on the first exam in international relations.
And
So-
you vote on whether it's a well-structured question. Right.
So, all right. So I guess, go ahead, Aisha, the first person to ask a question. Very good.
I'll start us off. So you said that the U.S. was able to get like 10% of its energy from Russian nuclear material. I was wondering, do you personally support the U.S. using nuclear energy as like a different energy source than like the energy that we use now?
So this is really a climate question, in effect. Well, we'll take a vote whether she gets the extra credit. But
And Aisha is a specialist on climate change.
I see. Okay. Yeah. So so the answer in the end is going to be yes, that we need to maintain nuclear energy as an option for decarbonizing electricity. Some places will want it, some places won't. It'll depend upon the new technologies. But let me just say the reason, I think the rationale, all I care about is the carbon. I don't, I'm completely neutral in terms of what the technologies are to get there. All I know is we're going to need a hell of a lot of them, and we can't afford to leave any of them on the table for getting to low carbon. The climate crisis, if you like, has led to a considerable effort to make the low carbon targets much more stringent than they were even in Paris in 2015. So for example, in Paris in 2015, the outcome was that the world should reduce emissions by 80%. Now, as we've seen, probably more than we'd like to see in terms of what's happening with global warming, we are seeing a much more significant commitment in the United States. Many cities and states in Europe, many countries are now committing to what's called net zero. I could discuss net for a long time there, but let me just not do that for the moment. That is one hell of a challenge. And you're only going to get there with several things. One is you will need, this is net, you will need major negative carbon technologies, which we don't really have available today yet at scale and at cost. You will need to completely decarbonize the electricity sector as the lead horse compared to transportation and industry and agriculture and the like. And then you will need, when you have that very low carbon electricity or zero carbon electricity, you will need to electrify as much as you can in the rest of the economy to take advantage of that. That's all necessary but not sufficient. But in that spirit, I just cannot endorse putting any low carbon technology aside. And that includes nuclear, especially the new nuclear that I hope to see deployed starting in the next decade or so-called small modular reactors with advanced technologies, molten salt. We can go into that, in high temperature gas, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really important. But I think I will make one more point. I'm sorry, but I have long answers, even if it's short questions. There is, to put it completely bluntly, a fiction that we can do zero carbon electricity with wind, solar, and batteries. It is not credible at all for a whole variety of reasons. We will need, it could be natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration. It could be nuclear. It can be modern hydro. But we will need other generation technologies. And more important than that, in a certain sense, even, is we will need a multiplicity of different storage solutions, because storing electricity for a few hours ain't good enough. You need it for days, weeks, months, seasons, years, if you have, for example, a dependence on hydro, which has enormous annual variations. So that's the context that I look at it. It's all about the carbon. If I can use nuclear, great, let's do it. It's got to obviously pass economic tests, et cetera. Sorry, long answer.
Thank you very much. So do we have any other students? Sophie?
So I was wondering if you think that it's achievable to have a nuclear-free world with countries such as like North Korea, who nuclear possession actually does a lot for them because they're still able to do whatever they're doing in their country and still, well, not be challenged by any big country for things that they're doing wrong. Yeah.
No, it's an important question, and certainly we will not give up on the goal of a nuclear weapons-free world. But having said that, we do think that that is not going to be in the immediate future. By the way, many would like to think about like 2045, and it's 100 years of nuclear weapons and then move on, but we'll see. But just to say that at NTI, and I'm going to go back to your question with Korea in particular, but at NTI, while we fully endorse that goal, our approach to life is, let's not have a nuclear weapon used again. And step by step, sometimes they're big steps, sometimes they're little steps, but you just got to go step by step along what is a regrettably long road towards that outcome. Now, with North Korea, so you say, okay, well, North Korea will never give up nuclear weapons. I don't buy that. Okay? I don't think they'll give them up easily. They won't give them up without, as I mentioned earlier, and let me just repeat it, a serious resolution of the regional security situation. It's North Korea, South Korea, Japan, China. While there is this kind of tension in many ways, even between our allies, after all, it's going to be very, very difficult. So that's why it's a long road. You've got to have a strategic view. There will be some risks involved in terms of providing incentives along the way and assuming that they can eventually get rid of their weapons. But I think the view has to be this. I strongly feel everything is here step by step, with a strategic view of where we want to go.
Thank you. So how many more student questions do we have? Yeah, we have. Okay, so Nathan then. Okay, then maybe we'll move on to others. So yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Shoot, I just kind of lost it for a hot second. So you talked about how Russia was thinking about making the statement of saying we shouldn't use nuclear weapons, especially since that statement was made after World War II, or
The 80s.
the 80s, the Cold War. What then would America do? And do you think maybe it should bring back the nuclear weapons to kind of
What do you
sort
mean?
of
What do you
help,
mean? What do you mean bring
like,
back from Europe?
well, not proliferate nuclear weapons, come up with new technologies to kind of help with that front of nuclear weapons are bad, and maybe bringing it back? I mean,
Well, okay. I mean, first of all, I think nuclear weapons don't care very much whether they're called bad or good. It's what we do and don't do with them, obviously. But you said bring nuclear weapons back, so I may be answering a question you didn't mean, but nevertheless, the United States, it's obviously well known that we have a considerable number of nuclear weapons deployed in Europe. And not so recently, the president declassified one of the countries in which they are sitting. He mentioned Turkey as being one of those countries. We, at NTI, we have a paper, you can look it up, that we recommend that all of the forward deployed weapons should be removed. That may seem counterproductive, or counterintuitive, excuse me, at the moment, given relationships with Russia. But our view is that their deployment serves no military purpose. It's purely a political purpose. But it also, having them spread around like this, it also increases risks, including terrorist kinds of risks, et cetera. So we just think that we've got all the tools we need for deterrence. We don't need these forward deployed weapons, complicated command structures. We're going to have, Europeans flying planes with our weapons. That's that's a terrific recipe for making a decision in 10 minutes. So I think it's you can't do it without the political work with our allies. Again, none of this is simple. You don't just wake up one morning as the president, I hope, and say, all right, get them out, because there would be lots of concern on our allies, some of our allies. But that's the kind of step that we should take, in my view, our view at NTI, that would lower risks substantially.
So actually, I have a follow. So, I mean a little bit of follow. If we were to make the negotiations with Russia about taking some of it back, do you think maybe they could try taking some of theirs back?
Well, sure. So, for example, the INF Treaty was about weapons deployed close to the Iron Curtain, basically, at that time. And so we should, for example, in my view, terrific policy, no nuclear weapons from the Atlantic Ocean to east of the Ural Mountains. There you go. Verifiably.
As always. Thank you very much. So I had noticed that the gentleman with the cool jazz hat had a question first, other than my own students. So if you still have it, yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. My name's Jeremy. I'm a board member of New Hampshire Peace Action. I work with the New Hampshire Nuclear Weapons Working Group. I have two of my colleagues sitting to my left. right here, and I also work for the Union of Concerned Scientists. I appreciate your preface to your remarks about the unique position that New Hampshire voters are in with being able to engage directly with presidential candidates. I've been at work with my colleagues very hard this campaign season, trying to get candidates to talk about this during their campaign speeches. And it appears that it's really a third rail topic at this point. There are candidates who talk about this unprompted from audience questions. In my personal experience with other candidates, they will tell you in a side conversation that they are also concerned with the existential threat that nuclear weapons pose, and say that they talk about it, and then go back to their campaign stump speeches and do not talk about it. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on trying to get presidential candidates to remove this topic from the third rail so that we can actually have that fruitful conversation that you referenced.
Well, I think first of all, it requires a whole bunch of your colleagues to be doing the same thing that you're doing, because let's face it, in the political world, when things are heard enough and are viewed as something that voters really want to hear about, they'll talk about it. If it's viewed as only a couple people here and there, it's less compelling. However, we'll see what happens. Look, we did a similar outreach in Iowa as well a few weeks ago, and I don't know. We're not going to claim causality. All we can do is we can just do what we do, and that included, like today, actually, we met with a similar group in Des Moines of concerned and actively engaged citizens. We also did various media, radio, TV. We did that as well today here. Talked to editorial board, etc. And I don't know, but for example, in the last debate in Iowa, it's a fact that there was more focus on security issues than there had been before. So again, we can't claim credit. All we can claim is that we're one of those beating the drum and hoping it goes forward. So I don't have any magic thing other than keep at it and get others here to join you.
So, would you like to speak up next?
I do have a question. I've been trying to decide between two questions, but I'll give you the one that I think is probably most relevant here. You sat across the table from technical experts from Iran, and I wonder, do you feel that the Iranians want a bomb in some way, or do you feel that what they're doing, developing the nuclear program, holding out, is really a bargaining chip to provide them the security without having to double down and throw out the big time table stakes of actually developing such a weapon?
As I said earlier, I wrote a piece called "Don't Trust and Verify, Verify, Verify." So in the end, that's what matters to me. What I would say, I will answer the question more directly with a negative. I think I'm not sure it's a negative. Anyway, I think it is quite credible that today they are not intent on developing a nuclear weapon. But my opinion doesn't matter. Don't trust, verify, verify, verify. And that's why the agreement actually, former Secretary of Defense Mattis, in testimony before the Congress, said something that I very much appreciated. He said, I've read all 150 pages of the JCPOA 3 times, and sure doesn't sound like somebody's trusting somebody, because it was so detailed. It's been called anal retentive compared to other acts of diplomacy, which often have all kinds of general statements and then there's reinterpretations, et cetera. We felt, precisely because despite the denials, there's no doubt that they had an organized nuclear weapons development program, ironically with one missing ingredient, the nuclear material, but they had that. It was a sustained program over many years, so they, frankly, did not earn the trust other than through agreeing to this pretty strong, very, very strong verification measures.
Okay, so how about, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but you right there, Susie. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Vulnerability. I'm interested in understanding your opinion about our vulnerability in the United States of America, and specifically taking it apart in terms of technical, chain of command, and on and on and on. Your thoughts about that in very concrete terms.
But again, could you just again clarify what's the focus of the question?
What's the pivot?
Yeah.
Vulnerability. What is our vulnerability here in the United States of America, and specifically in what areas?
To a foreign attack, you mean, or?
Absolutely.
That's what I mean. Yeah. Okay. That's
yeah, and I think that's what's on people's minds.
Yeah. Well, again, it's the simple fact that Russia has thousands of nuclear warheads, as do we, and they have very advanced and now even more advanced delivery systems for those vehicles, for those weapons. So from that point of view, we are vulnerable, but that is offset by the guarantee that we would not be put out of business by a first strike, and that's the conventional deterrence that we've always had. But it's it's not a very satisfying way of providing security, as opposed to continuing again the arms control reductions, the verification measures. But from that point of view, you can decide yourself whether that means vulnerable or not vulnerable. Technically, physically, we are vulnerable. There's no doubt that if they were to choose, they could drop nuclear weapons in the United States. But it would be inviting a very harsh response. Neither society would win. Frankly, it goes back to the statement, nuclear war between the U.S. and Russia really cannot be won. So why would you fight it? I think the issue is we need to lower the risks. We cannot lower the risks without a joint effort that turns down the risk in some commensurate way to maintain a balance. And that's why there can be a lot of destabilization with a lot of these new systems. Like I mentioned, this torpedo, for example. So without, I mean, it's all a question of having that systematic, organized, persistent, long-term strategic view of we are going to lower the risks until we can eventually eliminate nuclear weapons. Of course, as we make that progress, as we make that progress, then there's no doubt that there will need to be at some point the much more multilateral focus with China and with the other states. But we're a long way from that.
Thank you. So you've had your hand up for a while. Why don't I just hand this to you?
Thank you. It seems that in this, the world seems to be heading toward a hyper-nationalism. All sides kind of saying bad words to each other. How do we develop a trust structure, or if not a trust structure, some kind of agreement that would lead to verification possibilities? At this point, I've got my gun, I'm going to keep it, and how do we begin a discussion between the various entities that would allow us to try to get back to perhaps a simpler time like the Cold War?
The good old days, you mean? Right, right, right. Look, I don't have any magic solution. All I can, I mean, you know, I think I've made it pretty clear, I hope, that I'm kind of like a down in the trenches guy, you know? I mean, you got to have a view of where you're going and just keep working at it. And I think that the opportunities are there, I believe, to take these step-by-step actions. But you gotta work at it, and that's where I think one needs commitments that also aren't measured in 4 years or 8 years, and that's one of the issues that we now confront. That, you know, the arms control agenda has been for many decades. It probably needs to be refreshed. For one thing, because technology is so different. And you know, you go back many decades in the Cold War, and there was kind of a bright line between strategic nuclear weapons systems and other military systems. Those lines have been blurred with new technology. And so I think that's the real issue. Is we need to get back at it step by step, et cetera, but we also have to broaden the aperture to take account of the new technology realities. I might add, by the way, if I may make a completely different statement, but in a similar vein, at NTI, we have also in the last 2 years taken up a major focus on biosecurity, and the reason that we are involved in it. I mean, obviously there are pandemics out of the wild like Ebola, et cetera, but the reason that we are involved in it is because of the new technology in synthetic biology and the possibility of engineered organisms causing pandemics. So this theme of trying to have a relook at a lot of these issues in the context of where technology is and is going is very important. Obviously, AI is another major example, which we also have some very interesting results on, but for some other time.
Dr. Moniz, it's almost 7:30. Would you be willing to take a couple more questions, or do you need to move on?
I need to move on, but to take two quick ones.
Two quick ones. Okay. So, the young man in the back there.
So, as a young student, most of us students have just recently had the right to vote, and with the upcoming elections, we're all looking at how our president, the impeachment process is upon us at this very moment. So, besides who to vote for using our better judgment, what do you suggest the younger generations do about this issue?
Again, I'm obviously not going to get into the political realm. The issue is, I think, to recognize, as with other threats like climate change, it's your future, and and I hope you care about it, and you want to see the leadership in this country also care about it. Right? Well, I was in Davos last week, and without getting into detail, spoke with a very interesting person with a considerable resources, and basically what he said is, when I think about human lives, he didn't say it this way, but what he in effect said, when I think about human lives, my discount rate is 0. They're all valuable, whether today or many years in the future. And we got to think that way, actually, in this issue in particular, and climate change as well.
Hi, I'm Carolina. Many of us here, we've been very interested in this issue for a long, long time, and we get so concerned hearing about the importance of it, and we leave these meetings wanting to know what we can do to remain hopeful. In the 80s, we worked on the Nuclear Freeze campaign. It started in Vermont with town meetings, and some of us feel that maybe that had some effect on convincing Reagan that he should sign the treaties. At this point, some of us are working with the Union of Concerned Scientists and the Physicians for Social Responsibility with the Back from the Brink program, the 5 points. I have the points with me if some people are interested, but I wonder if you've heard of that program, the 5 points, if you agree with them. I can read them to you if you want. They're very...
I need a short question because I need
Yeah,
to leave.
it's renounce nuclear first strike, end the president's unchecked authority to launch nuclear strike, step down from the hair trigger alert, cancel enhanced nuclear weapons plan, do verifiable agreements to eliminate all nuclear weapons worldwide. We have gotten this passed in Durham, Portsmouth, Dover. We're doing warrant articles on it. We wonder if you think that this is a good way to go, and would you recommend that people in this room continue to work in this direction?
Well, I think actually, first of all, I think I've mentioned a number of those directly or indirectly, certainly. And I think that, again, as I said, in coming here, what I'm trying to do is encourage expanded civic engagement on these issues. So I'm all for it. Just one of them. Let me comment on. They're all important. The decision time issue. That, as I've said now a couple of times, President Trump or President Putin, for that matter, they both have maybe 10 minutes if some information comes in that could even be incorrect. Our view is that in these discussions, et cetera, the president should tell their militaries, you come back in a month with my options for increasing decision time. They command the military forces. Let the military say how they would solve that problem. And then if both sides go from 10 minutes to 20 minutes or 30 minutes, it's a huge game changer in terms of risk level. So I think pushing those points and getting it across that there is broad civic desire to go into this direction of minimizing risk, eventually eliminating that risk, is absolutely right on, and I can only applaud you for doing it. Yeah.
All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Secretary Moniz and Professor Jordan, for this lively conversation. Before you all start to head out, I just want to make a couple reminders. First of all, our next event is going to be on the 31st with Deval Patrick. It's part of our Presidential Foreign Policy Campaign Series. Posted about 5 or 6 of them already and are hoping to maybe squeeze a few more in before the end of the year. We also, on February 6th, will be hosting our first Global Tipping Point series, which will be on rising populism in Italy and France. And for all of you who are members here tonight, thank you very much for being members. For those of you who are not yet members, we hope that you support the organization, that you enjoyed yourself tonight, and will consider becoming a member and supporter of our nonprofit. We really do need your help to continue to bring these great programs to the state. So you can talk with Larry in the back, with myself, or with any of the board members you may see around, and we can get you signed up, whether it's for a membership or just our email list to make sure that you're aware of all of the great things that we'll be doing in the coming weeks and months. To all the students, you are free, so if you give us your email, you can be on our list and be a member of this great organization. So, having said that, thank you again to Secretary Moniz for his time and his wonderful insights, and thank you all for coming.